It's a lady named Dr. Naomi Remen, who is a psychiatrist, or was a psychiatrist, who treated people struggling with cancer. And at one point she told the story of a young man who had been diagnosed with cancer in his leg. And this young man had been a tremendous high school and college athlete. And until the time of his diagnosis, he had kind of lived life in the fast lane. He had been a womanizer, and almost everything he did just was tremendous. He had gotten tons and tons of recognition at every step of the journey. But 2 weeks after his diagnosis, with little hope, the doctors were forced to remove his right leg. And so in the aftermath of that, his life kind of spiraled out of control. And as his life began to fall apart, he became very, very angry and self-destructive. So he ends up going to this Dr. Remen, the psychiatrist, and she asked him at the first meeting to draw a picture of his body. And so she gave him crayons and a piece of paper, and this angry young man drew a crude sketch of a vase. And running through the center of that vase, he drew this deep crack right in the middle of it with a black crayon, and he just kept going over it and over and over it till the point where the paper began to tear. And the psychiatrist, what she said was, it seemed to me that that drawing was a powerful statement of his personal pain and his personal loss. It was a symbol, she said, of the failure of his body and the death of his image of himself as this able-bodied person with two legs. And at the end of the appointment, she took that drawing, stuck it in the file, put it in the filing cabinet. But she said gradually over time, this young man's anger lessened, and eventually he began to heal by beginning to reach out to other people, which is so often the case in life. Sometimes your inner healing comes by reaching out to help others. So the doctors, the surgeons began to invite him to visit other patients because they were seeing what a positive impact he was making on people. The surgeons were just delighted at the response of other patients, and they just kept referring more and more people to him as someone he should go see. And so one time he was invited or asked to go see this young woman who had kind of a tragic family history. All the women in her family had been diagnosed with breast cancer, and it had claimed the lives of her mother, all of her aunts, several of her cousins, and when her older sister was diagnosed with cancer as well and she began chemotherapy, this young lady felt driven to action. Now this is quite some time ago, but she took the only option that seemed available to her at the time. She had both of her breasts removed surgically. So she's in this hospital room with some music playing in the background, but not engaging anyone. And so she's depressed, laying in bed, her eyes are closed, when this young man appears on the scene, appears in her room to visit. And he tries everything he can to bring her out in conversation. She will not even look at him. And if you've ever been in a situation where you're a little nervous because someone's not responded, you just start saying things that make it go from bad to worse. This is what happened to this young man. He started saying things that ultimately were offensive. He tried jokes, and those jokes were horrible. He even got angry at himself, or angry because she's not responding. Finally, she just doesn't respond, so he's so frustrated. Finally, what he does is he just reaches down, takes his leg off, and throws it down. And all of a sudden, she looks at him, and she sees this leg on the floor and sees this guy's been through something as well. It was like a light bulb went off. And he begins hopping around the room, sort of dancing to the music of the radio, and she begins to smile. And that was the beginning of their friendship. Actually, down the road, these two fell in love and eventually got married. But sometime after this, he goes to the psychiatrist for one final visit. And during that visit, she reaches into the file and hands him that picture. Says, "Do you remember that picture that you drew?" And he looks at it, and he said to her, "It's not finished." So she says, "Do you want to finish it?" And he says, "Yeah." She hands him some crayons. He pulls out a yellow one, and what he does is from where that black crack is, he starts to draw these yellow streaks every single direction to the edges of the paper. And he smiles and points to that crack and says, "That's where the light begins to shine through for others to see." You know, when you and I have faced tragedy or hardship, we may think to ourselves, "This is it, I'm done, I can't do it anymore." And we remember what the psalmist says. We remember what Christian read this morning. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." You know, these times that we face of suffering and difficulty and hardship ultimately are temporary realities. God enables us to go through the valley of the shadow of death. There is always a path through. There is always ultimately a way out, because we remember what the psalmist proclaimed. We remember that the antidote to anxiety is remembering an incredibly important point. That Jesus the shepherd, God the shepherd, is always with me, and he is always there to lead the way. To know that you and I are never alone, to know that God's presence and strength and comfort are always available to us, to know that God has created us and will always hold us in the palm of the hand is incredibly powerful knowledge. That knowledge enables us to look beyond temporary hardship. It enables us to ultimately remember that our life always has purpose, today, tomorrow, and forever. Remember how Psalm 23 ends, "And surely goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." That's most translations say forever. That's what the original psalmist said. Forever. That is the promise of our faith. And we hold to that fact that God's love is an unfailing love, and that one day we will see him face to face, and we will be so free of every burden that weighs us down here and now. People who know Christian hymnody for generations will know the name George Matheson. George Matheson was a young seminary student in Scotland with a promising future in front of him, and one day, mysteriously, he lost his sight, and it never ever came back. And his fiancée quickly broke off the engagement. It was a struggle for him to finish his education. It was a struggle for him to become a pastor. And even when he did graduate and was ordained, they stuck him in probably the most remote, small parish with very, very few people. And you could imagine he could have been so incredibly bitter, yet he is one of the people who wrote one of the most beautiful hymns of all time as a testament to what he felt inside. The hymn was called, "O Love That Will Not Let Me Go." And one of the verses reads like this: "O joy that seekest me through pain, I cannot close my heart to thee. I trace the rainbow through the rain, and feel the promise is not in vain, that morn shall tearless be." You and I are people, we remember a guy named St. Paul. Paul lived kind of a life of great drama and heartache. He was also he was the greatest missionary of all time in Christian history. He was a person who inflicted some pain on other people, but he was one in the long run who was willing to suffer for his faith. And while under house arrest one time in Rome, he simply took out a pen and paper and wrote to a church that mattered to him a great deal, the church in Philippi. And he said to them, "I have learned to be content with whatever circumstances are in front of me. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content, and in every situation, whether well-fed or whether I'm hungry, whether living in plenty or living in want." And then he says, "I can do all things through him who strengthens me." You know, and I don't know what kind of valley you personally may be going through. I know some of the stories of the people of this church, And I know that there are people in your life who are going through some difficult times. But rest assured and remember the promise of God. The Lord is always with you. You are never alone. And by His grace and His leadership, He will always help you make it through. The Lord is your shepherd. You do not have anything to be afraid of. Amen.